Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Art of Adaptation. So back in my first video I talked about the possibility of a movie based on the Metroid franchise. This time I'd like to go into more concrete details and personal thoughts. This is of course a little navel-gazy, but I'd like to structure this as a sort of fan pitch. Now this exercise has three very specific purposes. One, to help me contextualize the process of adaptation, at least on the creative side. Two, a way to communicate what I consider more personal views on a particular project. And three, it provides a useful way of structuring these thoughts so that people can tell what I'm talking about. It is not a valid critique on other adaptations. I will criticize adaptations in an appropriate venue, like when I do videos specifically criticizing something. So in this video, if I reference something, I'm only using it as a reference to illustrate a point. This also isn't an I could have done it better video. For one thing, the movie in question doesn't exist. And for another, this isn't a movie. It's a discussion of adaptations via a hypothetical pitch. So if you like my pitch, cool, I might be on the right track with this. But making a movie is a long and complicated process that I'm not going through. If a movie or game or comic or whatever is made that I did a pitch for, my pitch would not be a fair point of comparison. With that out of the way, let's start talking about making this movie. Starting with pre-production. So pre-production is the step of movie production that might have the biggest effect on the overall quality of a film. And yet, it's kind of boring. At least if you like looking at movies from the lens of art as opposed to commerce. It's a lot of budgeting and scheduling and negotiating. It also can tend to be kind of hush-hush until much later than other aspects of production. For our purposes though, let's talk about a few points. Specifically, let's talk about what movie we would make and who would make it. So the first part of our theoretical mission statement is figuring out what specifically we are trying to adapt. So as of right now, there are 11 pieces of Metroid content that have narratives. The 4 mainline Metroid games, the first 2 of which received remakes, the Metroid Prime trilogy, the 3 oddballs, Hunters, Other M, and Federation Force, and lastly, the manga. As I said back in part 1, I think the manga won't really work for a movie, or at the very least it would be more trouble than it's worth. And because this is the first movie, any direct sequels can be put off until we get there. We can also probably eliminate the bad ones. This leaves us with 3 games. Metroid Prime Hunters, and the original Metroid. And I think the original Metroid is the best choice. You see, each of these games don't require previous experience to follow the plot with any lingering questions of significance. And so we could theoretically skip the first game and do it later as a prequel, right? Well, potentially, but as I said, outside the gamer community, Metroid is one of the lesser-known franchises. So I think it behooves the movie to just start at the beginning so we don't leave Joe and Jane Normal behind. It is worth considering the other 2, though. Metroid Prime is in some ways easier to adapt as it only really has 2 boss characters with narrative importance, and effectively works as an origin story for one of the series' best villains and one of its coolest MacGuffins. Hunters has a large number of other bounty hunters in its cast who are in some respects more interesting characters than a lot of the traditional space pirates. Plus it helps build the world more than most individual games do. But while I think those are valid points for those 2 games, I still think Metroid works best as a first movie. You see, Metroid, particularly in its remade form, works as an excellent introduction to our main character. Metroid takes place on what is effectively her home planet, and the bad guys are ones Samus has past history with. This is why our Metroid adaptation should, at its core, be a character piece. Ultimately, this movie will likely be the first Metroid thing most people experience. You see, one of the dirty little secrets about narrative art, particularly in non-interactive mediums like film, is that people are way more likely to graft onto specific characters than themes or even visuals. You see this in games too, though they can sometimes work around this because gameplay is inherently engaging. But this was a huge part of why no one bought Federation Force. So what we're trying to make is a character piece that uses an action-adventure framework set in a soft sci-fi science fantasy world with a few horror elements thrown in. It needs to be fairly intense, using a stark contrast between physically dangerous events and the calmer, more sober moments of relative physical safety. Now, if we were actually making a movie, it would be really important to seriously and granularly define Samus as a character. But we aren't actually making a movie, so I'll try to keep it brief. So our Samus is in her early 20s and still relatively new to bounty hunting. But she's on the rise and is fairly well known. She's a human raised by aliens and has gone through some pretty extreme trauma. She's a Byronic heroine living largely in isolation and having an outsider status. She's disciplined and motivated, working specifically to protect the innocent citizens of the galaxy. She also hasn't really processed her trauma, but is trying to cope with it in her own way. She's not emotionless, but does keep a pretty tight grip on her feelings. And all of this characterization should be implied rather than outright stated so as to keep her open to interpretation. But who's making this movie? Well, there are two individuals who I think are really make or break positions. The director and the lead actress. Both of them are really important as the two of them have to overcome a fairly meaty challenge. Because Samus has essentially no one to talk to. She lives alone and works alone. So our director needs to be someone who is really good at visual storytelling. It also would be kind of nice if they had experience working with effects-heavy production and maybe someone with a love of sci-fi or, God forbid, even the original source material. There aren't a lot of good choices and there are very few great choices, but Guillermo del Toro might work if he could be convinced to stay on the project. Ultimately though, the choice of director would likely be determined by availability more than anything else. And the same goes for the actress playing Samus. Whoever plays her will need to be both physically imposing and a good physical actor, because she'll likely need to get across most of her character through body language and facial expression. But she doesn't necessarily need to be a jacked Amazon in the audition. Hollywood has lots of techniques to get people into the shape they need to be to play specific parts. As for who could play her, I've got no fucking clue. Samus is a weird part, by Hollywood standards anyway, so it's hard to point to someone and say she could probably do it. I mean, if Charlize Theron could be effectively made to look the appropriate age, maybe? But personally, I think it might be worth taking the same approach the original Superman movie did. They wanted an actor people would see as Superman during the movie, and as an actor after the credits rolled. So they found some undiscovered talent and did a really good job of that. Star Wars did a similar thing for its leads. This isn't an easy thing to pull off, but it might be the best choice. So now let's start talking the actual production itself. As a sci-fi story with only one human character who spends almost the entirety of her time stomping around in power armor, a movie adaptation is likely going to be effects heavy. So let's talk about CGI. Because I'm not old and or a member of the Academy, I don't have an inherent hatred for digital effects. But I also think it's important to remember visual effects are a gestalt art. So yes, a lot of stuff will have to be CGI. But one of the lessons Jurassic Park taught us is that a little help from the practical effects can help sell CGI, especially where 3D models are concerned. Game of Thrones is also a good object lesson for how to utilize CGI. Ghost, for instance, is often made giant through trick photography, helping us believe he's real even when his digital stunt double takes over. Iron Man also created an interesting method for building his armor out of partially real components enhanced with digital components. Something that might just be a little important for a movie about Samus. Sets are also a good way to help keep things feeling believable. Cough cough, Star Wars prequels cough. So as a rule of thumb for this movie, I would try to use practical effects first and then use CGI to pick up the slack. But much like how we needed to pick our story, we also need to pick our visual references. You see, while I think you need to do Metroid 1's story, I don't think you need to use Metroid 1's visuals. Heck, the original game was kind of ugly, even in like the concept art stage. But rather than go into every single thing that might need to go into this movie and figure it out, I'll just give my thoughts on a few important ones. This guy is the second most recurring character in the Metroid franchise, second only to Samus herself. As such, he's had a lot of variations. He also looks awful in Other M, and this teaches us a lot about what made his design work. Like the hook on the end of his beak or his skeletal body. Now there is some debate on how much detail he needs on his body. His Super Metroid version is very busy, and it might need to be toned down a little bit. Ridley will probably need to move fairly quickly to be really threatening, and a really busy design might run into the same problem as those terrible Transformers movies. Personally, I would shoot for something between his Super Metroid design and, weirdly enough, his appearance in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Ridley may be the most recurring villain of the series, but Mother Brain is the most important one for a movie adaptation of the first game. and she's going to be kind of hard to make look good. Now, I think the later game's attempts to make her look less amorphous and more brain-like were a mistake. And I actually feel that way about the big central eye. I think sticking close to her original appearance would be smarter. I would also save her body for a later movie. So fans will know the Metroid design we see most of the time is actually a Metroid larva. And I think there's a reason why designers stick to this thing. It truly seems alien. Especially the way they move. They don't seem to do anything to float around. I think that weird, off-putting movement is especially key to helping them feel different from everything else. Samus needs to look athletic and imposing. As for what she's wearing though, not the Zero suit. This thing has never looked good to me. It looks uncomfortable more than anything else. And like I said in the last video, I would be very cautious about how Samus is presented in terms of sexualization and objectification. She doesn't need to go around wearing her muumuu, but she shouldn't look like she's wearing something designed more to be looked at than worn. As for her armor, I think the Various suit is the way to go. I know in the game it's technically an upgrade, but it's more iconic and frankly better looking than the standard power armor she starts out with. And I'd want to stick pretty close to the Metroid Prime version. Just be careful how large her shoulder pads are and how thin her waist and limbs are. The environments should evolve as the story progresses, and needs to become slowly more sci-fi-ish as the narrative goes forward. The biggest problem in adapting Metroid's visuals will be color. Metroid has a much brighter and more vibrant color palette than basically anything Hollywood ever wants to make. Like, we all like to make fun of Man of Steel's desaturated cold aesthetic. I personally love jumping on that dog pile. But it's pretty par for the course for a lot of mainstream movies. Even the DC Cinematic Universe's great rival, the colorful, vibrant Marvel Cinematic Universe, still tends to relegate its color to the big set pieces / trailer fuel moments. Only the Guardians of the Galaxy movies and the first Avengers movie have a vibrant color palette throughout most of it. So I can basically hear cinematic classicists all clench their butts at the thought of taking this palette and telling a serious story about a Byronic heroine. Especially because the Metroid universe is not a humorous one. Part of me says it's okay to bend on this. After all, one of the main reasons why Metroid has such a crazy palette is mechanical. We need to be able to clearly see and identify all objects on the screen. This is how Super Metroid gets away with such a cluttered environment. But I would hold on to the color design of Metroid for a pair of reasons. The first is that making the world easy to visually analyze and read is important for movies as well, and color contrast can help with that. Again, Metroid has a busy design sensibility. The second reason is related to the first. In much the same way contrasting colors can help important elements stand out, the palette can help the movie itself stand out. Something that might be important as blockbusters reach a sort of saturation point. So originally I was going to do a section on the soundtrack, but I feel like I kind of said what I needed to last time. So instead, let's go ahead and get to the most important part. The story and how to tell it. So quick disclaimer, this will be the most subjective part of the video. The other things are kind of Adaptation 101, but the story is where it's most likely for my own style to rear its ugly head. But Metroid is an important franchise for me, so hopefully this still feels faithful. So let's start with a quick discussion of the differing structures between games and movies. The story structure of movies is built on a series of scenes that form acts that form a story. Games have a somewhat similar but quite different structure. Games are built on a series of encounters that help form a difficulty and engagement curve, which helps to form and inform a game's story. And I think this basic structural difference is what makes it so hard to translate the story of games into other non-interactive mediums. So if we are turning an interactive story into a non-interactive one, we're working to turn encounters into scenes, and a story structured into difficulty/engagement curves into a story structured into acts. Now, this theory comes with a massive set of asterisks. That one, video game academic studies is still an incredibly young field, so in 20 years a lot of this theory of game structure will likely be outdated, as even now it's pretty hotly debated. And two, despite the idea of a story being structured into some number of acts, usually 3, is orthodox for most forms of narrative art, it isn't a topic without contentious discussion and debate. That is to say, all of this is purely theoretical, but I think it's a useful framework. So unlike scenes, not all encounters need to be narratively significant. They just need to be engaging, either through spectacle or more ideally through mechanics. But that's not true for movies, where every scene needs to serve the narrative in some way. So we need to figure out what encounters in Metroid are scenes, and then figure out which ones can be converted into scenes. So let's try to do that. Our story starts in space, with a series of establishing shots to communicate how big and imposing and empty the universe is, establishing that this story has galactic ramifications before we bring down the focus to just Samus and her ship. This setup is important as it gives us a chance to establish our main character and some of the world. So we start with Samus waking up and we follow her through her morning routine. We see her wake up, do some exercising, do some meditation, she takes a shower, has some breakfast, and then maybe does some upkeep work on her ship or her suit. This establishes her as competent, dedicated, professional, and controlled. As for world building, well, one part of most people's morning routine is to check the news and see if the world is still on fire. This lets us establish that there are space pirates and a galactic federation, who, again, don't need much more explanation than their names. Also that bounty hunters are more heroic and thought of more fondly than in our world. I might even set up bounty hunters as similar to sports stars. Like, I really think the idea of like an ESPN but for bounty hunters channel has some potential. Also that Samus is new to bounty hunting but is already near the top of her field, and that she operates enigmatically and is already being mythologized by a curious public. This all stops when Samus receives a contract offer from the Federation's military. I would use Admiral Dane and have him reaching out to Samus personally, trying to bridge the gap that formed when Samus left the Federation, explaining how she's needed for a dangerous mission because the space pirates have acquired a rare and extremely dangerous alien specimen called a Metroid. They plan on weaponizing it, and if they succeed, the galaxy could be threatened, yada yada yada. And here it's important to establish not only stakes, but the fact that this, unknown to Admiral Dane, may be personal to Samus. You know, have her start calm, but then she starts like clenching her fists and grinding her teeth. I would also use this interaction to play up how Samus keeps people at arm's length. Even this guy who seems to know her personally. Maybe have Dane appear on Samus' screen, but then when we see things from his side, it's just like blank or there's like a no signal symbol. And maybe have Samus' voice going through some sort of distortion effect. So Samus goes off to Zebes, and now we start adapting stuff from the game itself. So if you played the game, you know one of the most useful things you can find is the map room, which will help you find your way around. So this first scene on Zebes needs to be based on Samus scouting out the enemy. We can use this to plant a few concepts and lay down some ground rules for how stuff works. Have Samus fight some wildlife to show off what she and her suit can do, while also showing that her suit can incorporate new technology on the fly. Say by having her acquire the Morph Ball, which is usually the first upgrade in any game. This is also a good time to start establishing that the pirate base has been built in the ruins of some other structure, and also that Samus is being watched once she's in the compound proper. Eventually she finds a data center the pirates use and begins downloading files. Things like the base schematics, information about the Metroids, and files from the Chozo who were here before the pirates. Suddenly though, she's cut off as an alarm goes off, and this giant reptilian monster bursts up through the floor and collapses it into the room down below. Samus' scanner helpfully informs us that this is Kraid, a space pirate underboss with a sizable bounty on his head. This establishes that even though the space pirates may look like monsters, they are intelligent. Anyway, Samus beats Kraid in much the same way she does in the game, and yes, I would use the Super Metroid version so that he's like gigantic. The small one is just not as interesting. After this, Samus starts going through the files she acquired. We learn where the Metroids are and that they have a specific weakness to cryo weapons, so Samus can set a course for the Ice Beam upgrade. However, in the meantime, the big thing is the files left over from the Chozo, because now it's time to start digging into Samus' character and backstory. And these files are an important part of using a technique that many movies overuse: flashbacks. I think flashbacks tend to be used poorly because they're mostly used to tell the story out of order for no real reason. For us though, these files are going to be used to contextualize the events of the main story. Say, have Samus kill a few space pirates in an unusually brutal fashion while we learn that they killed her family. Or have Samus take a moment to mourn Old Bird while listening to an audio log of him talking about her. Little things like that can be used to add real depth to an otherwise irrelevant scene and can help communicate how Samus feels without her having to monologue about things. This context will largely make or break this movie. Anyway, there are 3 more encounters that need to be directly translated into the movie: beating Ridley, beating the Metroids, and beating Mother Brain. Ridley can theoretically be defeated either before or after acquiring the Ice Beam. And originally I planned on having Ridley either guarding the Ice Beam or having him ambush Samus on the way, but I think it's smarter to have Samus choose to go after Ridley. Say, have Samus's computer suggest an alternate route to the lab where the Metroids are, and Samus chooses to go kill Ridley instead. And I would have Ridley talk. He never has in the games themselves, but he does in the manga, and letting him communicate makes him more of a character and less of just a boss fight. I would split the difference and have him speaking in alienese with subtitles, though. I would have Ridley specifically call out Samus and her trauma, taunting her about her parents' death and calling her out on her desire for vengeance. You see, Ridley would likely need to be the midpoint of the movie, and it would help to hint at Samus's character by providing an outsider's perspective. I would also make this a way more brutal fight than her battle with Kraid. This would be one of those action scenes where I would seriously consider using the first-person view. Ridley can fly and therefore tends to battle Samus in large arenas. These types of settings can be epic and grand, but lack intimacy. Take this shot from The Two Towers. The battle between Gandalf and the Balrog feels huge, important, and epic, but it doesn't really communicate a personal connection between them, like, say, his fight with Saruman does. This battle needs to have that feeling of battling a nemesis, rather than an enemy. The first-person view can help keep things feeling like a conflict between two people who hate each other, rather than just a bounty hunter versus a bounty. After this, Samus can get the Ice Beam and fight the Metroids in a more horror-style encounter, basically fighting in a dilapidated lab where the Metroids have gotten out and can ambush her. And now we have to get a little bit creative. See, as Samus fights the Metroids, I would have Mother Brain talking to Samus over the intercom. Like Ridley, I would mostly have her taunting, but where Ridley was mostly doing this through the lens of her original family's death, I would have Mother Brain largely talking about the Chozo. Then, after this, I would have Samus once again face a choice like she did when she chose to kill Ridley. After all, Samus's mission is complete. The Metroids are dead. But now, if you'll forgive the cliche, it's personal. Or rather, we realize it's always been personal, and that on some level, Samus has always been doing what she does to help deal with her own issues. And now we come to the final confrontation, Samus versus Mother Brain, the two heirs of the Chozo. I would have Mother Brain explicitly call this connection out. So after going through a gauntlet of lasers and traps and deadly energy Cheerios, the two come face to face and Mother Brain reveals her trump card. If you kill her, the base will self-destruct. And so we once again see Samus faced with self-preservation and good sense versus revenge. And once again, she chooses revenge. She blasts Mother Brain and then escapes the base as it self-destructs around her. Hooray, galaxy saved! And we see people celebrating that fact. Things like Admiral Dane giving a press conference about the destruction of the pirate base, and the talking ESPN heads talking about the deaths of Kraid and Ridley, an interview with a space pirate survivor talking about how glad they are that the universe is that much safer. And yet, then we see Samus, who isn't happy. In fact, she seems more exhausted than anything else. In this, we realize how Samus has been changed by the events, but maybe not for the better. It's left ambiguous how Samus feels, now that all is said and done. In the immediate aftermath, she is simply too exhausted to process what she just went through. And so we end on her listening to one last log before she tries to get some sleep. Now, I'm a little uncertain as to who should get our last words, but I have 3 ideas. Maybe it should be Grey Voice. I haven't really mentioned him, but he's one of the Chozo who helped raise Samus. In fact, he's the one whose DNA is spliced into Samus. But he's the worst parent Samus has had, so a final goodbye from him would be interesting. Maybe it could be Samus's mother. A powerful message about how much she unconditionally loves Samus and wants her to be happy could be a transformative experience. The last option is for Samus herself to get the last word. As I mentioned in part 1, Samus does keep a personal log, so maybe hearing from Samus herself about what she's going through would be a nice ending. Now, I wouldn't do more than this, as it really could easily devolve into that other in-style monologuing, but reserving it for just the ending could work. Now, this is a really bare-bones overview, but I think that's a basic outline that could work. Okay, so this, in theory, is an unnecessary discussion, as a sequel should be built on the original movie and not the other way around. But modern Hollywood is a franchise machine, so... Okay, the way I see it, you have 2 choices. Either go to Metroid 2, the original sequel, or go to Metroid Prime, the next game in the chronology. Personally, I would go with Metroid Prime as I feel it's a little awkward to go straight from discovering the Metroids to deciding the Metroids must be wiped out. But I would make one major change. I would include the 3 bounty hunters from Metroid Prime 3. I don't want to go into spoilers because if you haven't played the Metroid Prime games, I would highly recommend it, but let's just say these 3 don't have a happy ending waiting for them, and having them show up a little earlier and getting to know them a little more would help Metroid Prime 3 feel more impactful. Plus, having the 3 of them around would make Metroid Prime feel different from Metroid. And that's kind of all I have to say at this point. So feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time for something a little different.